The Super Etendard adds some new French strike capability in War Thunder. Let's check it out. France had originally intended to replace their basic Etendard with a navalized version of the Jaguar strike jet, but the initial testing revealed some problems, and it looked like it was going to take quite a while for the Jaguar to be ready for carrier service. The Dassault company was able to use some pretty clever political maneuvering to get the naval Jaguar cancelled and get their fully domestic Super Etendard design into consideration. While maintaining some outward similarity, and its general structure was broadly based on its predecessor, the new jet featured a lot of updates and innovations. It had newly designed wings, an upgraded engine, a new radar and sensor system, updated navigation equipment, and compatibility with a pretty wide range of newer generation weapons, including the now famous Exocet anti-shipping missile. The new jet first flew in 1974, but some early problems with the prototypes, along with some funding issues, delayed service entry until 1979. In French service, the plane made a pretty good accounting of itself, and it saw combat in a number of different operations over the years. It was also exported to Argentina and Iraq, who both used it operationally in the anti-shipping role and had a fair amount of success with it. There were conflicting reports about the operational record in Iraqi service, and reliable information on the Iran-Iraq war is notoriously difficult to get, and some sources claim that it was able to seriously damage a whole bunch of enemy ships, while others claim that only light damage was caused to a much smaller number of vessels. The Super Etendard's most well-known service, though, was with Argentina during the Falklands War. The Argentine Navy was able to use them, along with the new Exocet cruise missile, to sink two modern British warships, which came as a huge shock both to the Royal Navy and international observers. In total, about 85 Super Etendards were built. What we get in War Thunder is the Super Etendard, a naval strike jet in rank 7 of the French tech tree at battle rating 10.0. Being a strike jet, it gets a ballistics computer with a CCIP for its rockets and bombs, and a CCRP for bombing. It also carries the Sherlock radar warning receiver, which is a very capable system for this BR range, with detection up into the J-band and threat identification. Not bad. The radar set is the Anemone anti-shipping radar. This is supposed to have both air-to-ground anti-shipping and air-to-air search modes, but in the game, it only functions as an air-to-ground radar looking for ships. However, you can lock aircraft using its boresight targeting, although the targeting frame is tiny. Since this is a J-band radar set, it won't set off most radar warning receivers below like BR 11.7, but just be aware that the blips you see in search mode are boats or ships, not aircraft. For loadouts, the jet gets 4 wing pylons and a pretty variable assortment of rocket pods, dumb bombs, air-to-air missiles, and laser-guided bombs. It can also take a centerline targeting pod and some countermeasure pods externally. Its air-to-air missile is the R550 Magic 1. This is a very effective rear aspect infrared dogfighting missile, which can slave to a radar lock and has 35 Gs of pull. This thing really is very effective in this BR bracket. The plane also gets up to 4 GBU-12 Paveway 2 laser-guided bombs. Now, these don't have the biggest blast radius, but they're very accurate with a valid laze, and they can pop just about anything you're going to fight on a direct hit. The flight performance of this jet may actually surprise you. It's technically transonic. It can hit just a tiny bit over Mach 1, but it doesn't have an afterburner, and its acceleration is pretty bad at higher speeds. So in most practical respects, it's going to be subsonic 99% of the time. Again, due to the lack of an afterburner, it may take a while to get up to maximum speed even in level flight, but the good news is this plane has surprisingly decent energy retention, with the flaps up, which I'll get to in a minute. And even though it can feel a little underpowered, it does a pretty good job of keeping its speed up most of the time unless you pull into hard vertical maneuvers. The rate of climb is surprisingly good for a ground pounder like this, and you'll find no big problems climbing up for high altitude bombing, or even doing air-to-air vulture tactics coming down from above with the R550s. Now, in terms of dogfighting agility, this jet is barely average, until you use its secret weapon, the combat flaps. It can drop its combat flaps at basically any airspeed, and they provide a significant and noticeable boost to its turn performance in almost all flight situations. With the combat flaps out, this thing can actually dogfight pretty well, but it's still going to get wrecked by dedicated turn fighters like F-5s or MiG-21s. Also important, the controls compress really bad at high speed, so if you're going into a dive or something, the air brakes and combat flaps end up being pretty important to manage your airspeed. Plus, its stability isn't great and it does tend to wobble a bit in a turn. Not a big problem, but just something to keep in mind. And don't forget that even though the combat flaps provide a really good boost to its overall agility, they are going to cause you to bleed off speed a little bit quicker, so just be cognizant of that. Taking the Super Etendard out into air battles isn't as awful as a lot of other strike jets around this BR. The generous supply of countermeasures is a huge help, and the fact that it can defend itself pretty well in air combat will be a big surprise to a lot of opponents. Its overall bomb load is pretty light, and it's slow, so it's not going to be taking out bases on its own, but it still carries enough to land you some points before you go in for air combat with the R550s. Your radar can't scan for air targets, but if you lock something up with the ACM targeting, very few jets in the game have a J-band radar warning receiver in this BR range, which is going to give you a little bit of an extra advantage. Now, where this jet really excels, though, is close air support. Holy smokes, is this thing a beast flying out above a ground battle. The targeting pod has an incredible optical zoom, allowing you to target with very high accuracy, even up from like 6,000 meters and higher. And it's got an auto tracker. Now, you can take up to 4 paveway laser-guided bombs, which are very accurate. And even though there's not a huge blast radius, they do hit hard enough to take out tanks in one shot. The main thing to remember is that if you climb up to space, they're going to take a while to impact, and your target can sometimes get taken out by someone else, drive into cover, move out of the way, pop smoke, or whatever. So it might be helpful to babysit the lays rather than rely on the auto tracker. Now, in this BR range, player-controlled SPAA is much less of a threat up at high altitude, and you've got tons of countermeasures, so the survivability ends up being a little bit better than a lot of other close air support jets in this bracket. Just be aware that your primary threat is actually going to be enemy aircraft rather than surface-to-air missiles. Plus, it's got a conventional ballistics computer, so even if you don't have the spawn points to get into the LGBs, its rockets and dumb bombs are still totally credible weapons and not too hard to use. The elephant in the room, though, is the lack of the Exocet anti-shipping missile. And unfortunately, I have confirmation from Gaijin staff that as of September 2023, they have no plans out into the medium term at least to add the Exocet or similar weapons beyond what's already in the game. So, a missed opportunity, but maybe someday. Visually, this is an okay looking jet, but I'll admit I feel a little let down that they didn't give us an Argentine Navy paint job for it. It seems like a bit of an oversight, but maybe someday we'll get one on the marketplace or something. For now, the French ones aren't too bad. Landing is easy, but this jet is still a little stiff at low speeds, so you may want to line up your approach a bit farther than usual, and try not to rely on sharp S-turns to dump speed at the last second. Now, being a naval jet, it gets an arrestor hook for carrier landings, and the anti-shipping radar can actually be useful to get an accurate distance measurement to the carrier, so bonus. It can drop gear and landing flaps at around 425 kilometers an hour. The cockpit is surprisingly good for a strike jet like this, with decent visibility in basically every direction. The radar scope is in a good spot, and the targeting pod camera is clearly visible inside the cockpit. The only issue I had was that a couple of the instruments are a little low, but overall it's still pretty good. To close out on the Super Etendard, this jet has a J-band anti-shipping radar. Its radar warning receiver is outstanding for this BR. It's surprisingly good in air combat. It gets a targeting pod and 4 laser-guided bombs. It gets tons of countermeasures, and it can do carrier stuff. However, the number of weapon pylons is low. It can feel a little underpowered sometimes, and it seems to be missing its primary weapon. The final verdict on the Super Etendard is, and I don't say this very often, but I was genuinely surprised at how good this plane is. It does reasonably well in air combat, and it's a monster for close air support. If only we had those exo sets. As always, thanks for watching.